Some of the disciplines we can posture and pose, like hospitality. You can show yourself to be very hospitable, and even if inside you are tense about it and feeling negative thoughts and all those things, someone on the outside could say, oh, they're so hospitable, they're so loving, they're so giving. Not all disciplines are like that. Some disciplines we can put a show on, and some disciplines are inherently counter any kind of show. They insist on an authenticity and a verifiability, promise keeping, the idea that our promises are either kept or they're not kept. With all the disciplines, and promise-keeping especially, we pursue as disciplines that which God emphasizes in his own work. God emphasizes hospitality. God emphasizes sending and receiving. God, go down the list of the various things we can find ways God expresses these elements. God is the God of promise. When we talk about promise-keeping, God is the exemplar of that. We see God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 17, 1 through 22. God's promise to Moses in Exodus 3, 7 through 22. God's promise to Mary and Zechariah in Luke 1, 5 through 80. God's promise of the Spirit in John 14, 15 through 29. All of these were promised before the moment of fulfillment even seemed possible. Look at these things. God promised to Abraham. He was old. God promised to Moses freedom. They were slaves to one of the most powerful nations of the world at the time. God promised to Mary and Zechariah. Zechariah was old, and Mary was unmarried. We come to the end, near the end of Jesus' ministry, and he's saying, it's good that I'm going to go away. Well, why is that good? How can we pull this mission off? Those in the early church would think. If you go away, what's up to us? Well, then the Spirit comes and empowers the people as participants. God is the God of promise. Promise isn't just a thing we say. Promise really is part of our identity. When we promise, we put our own self at risk. If we don't fulfill our promise, then we're not really who we say we are. We can't do that which we say we're going to do. So God defines himself also in terms of promises. What does God say to Moses, the burning bush? What's your name? I am. I want to free the people from Egypt. I am the God who will, he says to Moses, to Abraham. Go down the list throughout all of Scripture. I am the God who will do this thing. And then people have to respect this as being so true that they have to stake their whole being on it as well, because God is trustworthy. I am the God who will free the people from Egypt. So thus, when they're in the wilderness, God holds them to that belief, that faith, that God is going to fulfill his promises. And when they complain or grumble or lose heart, it's not simply a matter of the insecurity in the world, it's their lack of faith in God. So I am the God who will do these things, he says. And then, as the Bible continues and as God's work continues, we see this referred back. I am the God who did. Again and again in the Old Testament, we see God defining himself. I am the God who will free you from Egypt. And then after that happens, I am the God who freed you from Egypt. Therefore, trust me in the next thing. I am the God who will raise Jesus from the dead. Jesus is raised from the dead. Now, what does that say then in our own lives? Do we trust God in times of stress and anxiety? He raises people from the dead. Do you believe it? Don't just say it. But do you believe it in actually engaging life in times in which uncertainty seems overwhelming? Do you trust God in those times? God puts his identity at risk, we might even say, in regards to his promise. If God promises and fulfills, he's God. God raises someone from the dead who's been dead 3 days. We know that even death cannot overcome God's work. But if God didn't fulfill his promise, if God's unable to fulfill his promise, he's not really God, at least not in any kind of meaningful sense. And we're kind of scared of that language, the idea that God puts himself at risk, or that God might not fulfill his promise. Well, that's the very point, because God will fulfill his promise. That's the fundamental expression of Scripture. God is faithful to his promise. So the Exodus narrative is this archetype, rebooted in the cross, in the resurrection, the idea that slavery is what the Israelites experienced. Death is slavery. We're all captives to death. He freed the people from Egypt in an impossible way. He also now frees the people from death in an impossible way. I am the God who will bring you out of Egypt. I am the God who brought you out of Egypt. I am the Messiah who will be crucified and rise again. I am the one who was dead and now lives. Jesus is risen. Promise fulfilled. Do we hope in the promises yet to come, yet for fulfillment? Does God keep his promises? God is the God of promise. Possible exception. God is willing to adapt his promise in light of grace and love. Let's read Jonah 3. The word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time, saying, Get up, Go to Nineveh, that great city, and proclaim to it the message that I tell you. So Jonah set out and went to Nineveh, according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly large city, a 3 days' walk across. Jonah began to go into the city, going a day's walk, and he cried out, 40 days more, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. And the people of Nineveh believed God. They proclaimed a fast, and everyone, great and small, put on sackcloth. When the news reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne, removed his robe, covered himself with a sackcloth, and sat in ashes. Then he had a proclamation made in Nineveh, by the decree of the king and his nobles. No human being or animal, no herd or flock shall taste of anything. They shall not feed, nor shall they drink water. Human beings and animals shall be covered with sackcloth, and they shall cry mightily to God. All shall turn from their evil ways and from the violence that is in their hands. Who knows? God may relent and change his mind. He may turn from his fierce anger so that we do not perish. When God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil ways, God changed his mind about the calamity that he had said he would bring upon them, and he did not do it. God adapts his promise for grace and love, because grace and love is the deeper promise. God is love. God loves. His fundamental pursuit is to draw people back into him. And that's part of his promise too. Above all, God seeks love. So what is promise? Promise is trust. We trust in God in the circumstances that have not yet been resolved, because God has fulfilled promises before, in much more dramatic circumstances than those we are dealing with. So promise is hope. If we can trust God, we can have hope even in times of discouragement or frustration or when things seem too hard. We live in a new way in light of the promise. If we know something is certain, we will live as if it were already true. As I'm recording this, I look to next year, the end of spring, and I don't have a job lined up. My present job comes to an end. What do? Do I hope and trust? Or do I start getting anxious? I need to panic. Well, I'll be honest. The tendency for anxiety and panic starts to rise at certain points. But then I remember what God has done in the past, why I have this present job to begin with, how God has worked in circumstances that were so far beyond possibility. And I say, this time, I'm just going to do my job as I have it. I'm going to trust that God opens doors, because at each point, as I've rested in his trust, he's shown himself faithful. More faithful than I've been, more faithful than I deserve, but his promise isn't up to me. He invites me into the relationship. He invites me into experiencing peace even in the midst of strain. And if I can live into this promise, I can resonate hope and faith and light and love to those around me, to people in my family, those who hear my story. It becomes a testimony. Because if we're unsure, if we doubt God, we protect and defend ourselves in case it doesn't work out. We become people of panic, people of anxiety, people of stress, and we resonate that stress to those around us. So rather than resonate faith, we resonate chaos. We resonate frenzy. We resonate discouragement or doubt. What are you resonating in your life as you face struggles? And how can we be voices of hope and light to those around us? I think that is one of the chief callings of the people of God, to resonate hope and faith in the midst of difficulties, rather than say, this is a terrible thing and you have no hope, or you're subject to horrible forces beyond your control. We say, God is in charge. Live a life of light, not of panic. Live a life of hope and love, not of anger and fear. How would that translate into our church lives? How would that translate into our political lives, our economic lives? Do we trust in God? Do we have our hope in God? How is the way we're living express that? That's a question I ask myself all the time, and has been at times variously discouraging and variously encouraging as I see maturing in this. Promise is trust and hope. Christian hope is not a waiting or matter of wait and see. It is a creative expectation of the things that God has promised with the resurrection Christ. Those who passionately await something prepare themselves and their community for it. This is a quote from Jürgen Moltmann. In these preparations, the path of the coming one is prepared through attempts to correspond to what is anticipated with all the capacities and potentialities one has. These correspondences to the future God has promised are anticipation of this future. The person who hopes for the realm of freedom will desire liberation from political repression and economic exploitation here and now. The person who hopes for the righteousness and justice of the new earth will respect the earth here and now and will develop reverence for earthly life and will resist its exploitations and destruction. The person who hopes for the eternally living life will already be seized here and now by this unique, eternal, glowing life. It will make life live wherever he or she can. This freedom is not an insight into necessity. It is an insight into potentiality. This freedom is not a harmony of the existing conditions of power. It is their harmonization with what is to come. As the prophecy of Isaiah says, arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. Living God in the fullness of life. So God is the God of promise. And so what is God's promise to the world? We see that the world is being promised salvation. The world is being promised redemption. Something I wrote in my in my book, Transformative Church. Eschatology that is one of hope embeds the experience of life within the promise of God. It is only in light of this promise and the God who promises that life can be oriented in light of what is hoped for but not yet experienced. Moltmann writes, in order to attain to a real understanding of the eschatological message, it is accordingly necessary to acquire an openness and understanding vis-a-vis what promise means in the Old and New Testaments, and how, in the wider sense, a form of speech and thought and hope that is determined by promise experiences God, truth, and history and human nature. This real understanding of the eschatological message is provided by promise inasmuch as God himself defined his work through promise, initiating his work, declaring it certain before it is completed, then defining relationships with people based upon their reception and response to the promise. So God's promise to the world is the redemption of the world, a new heaven, a new earth. God so loved the world, he sent his son. In light of this promise, we are to live in light of the God's kingdom, which is already among us, and which will be fulfilled in the return of Jesus. The promised return is a promise of the consummation of God's work in, with, and for this world. We can be free in responding to others, not because they somehow deserve it, or because they've sorted out their own past, or somehow have earned the right. We can participate in light of this theme because God has promised that this is his work, this is his calling, this is his promise, and we are invited to become people who live in light of this promise of peace, hope, joy, love, even now. God is a God of promise. God's promise extends to us. What are the stories of God's promises and fulfillment of those promises in your life? Share with that. Share with us those stories as part of the discussions this week. What are the promises that are part of our calling? What are things that as ministers and leaders in the church, and whether in specific churches or in all sorts of other capacities, what are the promises that are part of our calling? Who are we called to live as? How are we called to respond to issues in this world? How are we called to respond in leading others? What are the promises that are part of our calling? Who has God called you to be? Do you believe him? What promises are you in the middle of now? All of you are in school. Why? What a waste of money, some might say. Who do you think you are, right? You might even be saying that to yourself. We're in the middle of a promise. You're in the middle of this experience in which you're investing all your being. For what? Some of you already have a for what. You're involved in your career and you're investing this. Some of you feel this yearning, this drive towards something, but don't see what it is. And it's very easy to get discouraged. What has God promised you? What are the promises? Not to have all the promises. You may not have a fancy car, huge income, but what are the promises that you need to hold on to in order for you to keep hold of the faith, love, joy, peace? The fruit of the Spirit means participating in the promise, walking with the Spirit, rather than every time the Spirit comes to encourage you, you say, no, I don't believe it. Oh, that can't be possible. Oh, this won't work out. God lets us have those beliefs, just like he did with the people of Israel, and yet he assesses us. Do you believe? He doesn't ask for us to accomplish. He doesn't ask us to put everything to practice through the work. He asks us to believe, to have faith in the midst of all the crises, to continue standing. So we feel the tension of the promise made, but not yet the joy of the promise fulfilled. Where is that for you? Feeling the tension of this promise, feeling the tension of being initiated. There's no turning around, but where are you going to go? So easy to turn back. So easy to give up. It's so easy to turn aside. But then we reach that point of fulfillment and we say, oh, God, you have been so good. Are you there yet? Have you experienced that in your own life? What are you experiencing in the middle of now? So what does this all mean for us? What is promise keeping for us in light of community? What is a person? Moltmann asks. A free human being is a being that can promise, as Friedrich Nietzsche once said, and who also keeps his or her promises, as every child knows. By promising, I pin myself down in my ambiguities. Through the promises I keep, I become trustworthy for other people. Through one's promises, a person acquires continuity in the flux of the time. One who forgets one's promises forgets oneself. A person who keeps one's promises remains faithful to oneself. This identity between a human person and one's life history is designated through one's name. Through my name, I identify myself as the one I was and as the one I will be. I sign my contract with my name and vouch for what I say with. So what happens if we fulfill a promise? We affirm our name. What happens if we break promises? Increasingly, our name becomes something else. We're shown to be posing, putting on a mask, presenting one face to the world, even as there's different motives or goals or priorities behind the scenes. We're called to be true to our promise. Promise is identity. What happens if we fulfill our promises? Who are we? We became more coherent. We have more integrity. Well, what happens if we break our promises? What does that mean for our identity? We become untethered from our words, untethered from our commitments. Promise is trust. So what happens with trust if we fulfill our promises? We invite trust. We awaken trust. We lower defensiveness. We lower wariness. What happens if we break our promises? People stop trusting us. They create defensive mechanisms. Even if they stay in relationships, there's an increased barrier, increased wall, and the less trustworthy we are, the more walls are created. As leaders, people become suspicious. I'll admit to that in myself. I have had a long cycle of experiences in my life, beginning early on, where I was in organizations or in other situations where leaders would say one thing and they would go off and do another thing. Or they would be committed fully to a group and then be gone the next year as a better opportunity opened up. Well, what does that say about them? They weren't committed. And then as years have gone by, I've become increasingly less trustworthy of leaders. Now, that's part of my own story. I know others of you have your own experiences, and so I don't see that as a universal issue, but I do see it as part of my own struggle and discipline. I don't trust leadership. I don't trust those in authority, which is a funny thing in my position. I do trust God. And so as I invest in new church when we move to Sacramento or invest in new opportunities, my trust is in God. And so being oriented and trusting God helps me continue to commit and continue to invest, even though I'm still relatively suspicious of people, and I have yet to have that suspicion allayed in present circumstances. But that's part of God's call for me, to trust in Him above all things. So what does that mean for me? If I'm committed to something, if I'm committed to an obligation or committed to a task, I don't want to be the person who just runs off and flits away. It transforms my own experiences. So often in the church this happens. Right? And since a lot of my experiences are also with the church, that's where a lot of my core experience have happened in this, where we talk so much about leadership. We talk so much about commitment for others. But then when the next opportunity opens up, or the next calling, as they say, opens up, the ambitions of pastors are often endless. Who do we trust? Now, again, that's not universal. There are some wonderful commitments beyond level, and so not make leveling the accusations. I'm just saying part of the difficulty in churches, in any Christian organization, is there is an inherent lack of trust. So part of expecting people to participate is building in trust. Part of our role as Christian leaders is to instill trust. So what happens if we fulfill our promises in light of that being a situation in this world where people aren't sure that to trust those in ministry? What happens if we fulfill our promises? We begin to restore a sense of peace and hope. Well, what happens if we become yet another who break our promises? As a dad, I'm very careful about my promises to my kids. And when I promise, I want them to trust that there may be delays, but that will be fulfilled. I'm not going to deny or be somehow seen as untrustworthy because I represent both myself, their trust in me as a father figure, but I also represent as a theologian and minister. There's this trust that they will connect with God, whether I like it or not. So who am I? Represents to them, for better or for worse, an element of how they trust others. Promises hope. If we are people who are known as fulfilling our promises, then people who trust us can await the fulfillment of that. They know that it may not always be within our abilities, but to their utmost, we will try to make it true. So they can hope with us, alongside us, and invest in that, rather than holding back and waiting to see. But what happens if we break our promises repeatedly? Well, people lose hope. People start entering into despair. We have no message anymore. Again, I'd suggest that's part of the problem with our current experiences of church, is a lot of promises, a lot of investment has been less than fulfilled in people's lives. And so as they encounter invitations to church or to Christ, they enter into that not with a hope and renewal, but with experiences and memories of how that's just words. Is it good news? Is the gospel good news? Well, that should be instill someone with hope. But so often people experience the gospel and evangelism as just sales, yet another advertising. Does our message, does our lives, does our community instill hope? So what happens again if we break promises? It puts the tension in our identity. It puts tension in those who trust us. It puts tension in their hopes, in our own hopes. If we're constantly breaking promises, it just becomes words to say without have any hope that even ourselves will trust it. Does that mean we're locked into promises once we're made? I don't think that's necessarily true. I think we have to be careful. The only reason we should be open to breaking a promise is if our promise puts us outside the obedience of God. Above all, we are committed to God, and we may enter into promises without a complete understanding. Or if our promises leads to sinful consequences, it's better to save our soul than to burn simply because we're trying to fulfill something. Yes, trust and hope will suffer, but more might suffer if we're entering into a situation that's causing more immediate harm. Now, the idea of obedience to God itself is a big question, because in past eras, my grandparents' age, and indeed my grandparents, who were missionaries, my wife's grandparents, who were pastors and district supervisors, so many evangelists and so many stories of those of the mid-century, they had this attitude that their obedience to God was priority over everything, that their obedience to God superseded even their marriage promises, their promises to their kids. And they had this assumption that their calling was something they should do and God would take care of the rest. Well, God calls us sometimes entering into promises and expects that to be that. And part of our obedience in marriage is committing to that marriage and not prioritizing other things. This is why Paul says it's better to be single, because single people can devote themselves fully to the Lord. But in being married, we are obedient to God and to our promises. God sees this marriage vow. God sees our commitments to our friends and others as included, precisely because community is not an extraneous element to the gospel. God calls us into loving relationships with others. And so the idea of obedience to God can easily become a religious flavored excuse, and God holds us to our promises. God doesn't put up with that very well. I'm trying to avoid generalities here and give opportunities and ways of discernment, but even these have to be nuanced in your context.